Greetings to those hiding in the dark. Today, I will tell you a story about the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy. It is not a bolter, and it is not a chainsword. It is a ledger. You might think you know what happens when a planet refuses to pay its taxes to the God Emperor. You imagine fire and fury immediately raining from the sky. You are wrong. The reality is a process much slower, much colder, and far more cruel. It is a place where death is not a tragedy, but merely a clerical error. The story starts right now. Before we open the books and descend into the silence, leave a like and subscribe. It is the only way I know that someone is still out there listening to these archives. Chapter 1: The Missing Digit. District D, Batch 47. Total sum 20,000 labor units. Acceptable attrition 5%. I murmured the numbers under my breath, the sound barely audible over the hum of the ventilation fans. I tapped the data stylus against the thick glass of the terminal. To me, they could not be people. If I thought of them as fathers, mothers, or children, I would never finish the shift. They were assets of the Imperium. They were biomass and potential energy, nothing more. That is what I told myself every night to find sleep. The office was cold, smelling of ozone and stale recyc air, a smell that coated the back of my throat like dust. I sat alone in the inventory spire high above the docking bays, watching the green text scroll down the screen. My world was defined by the rhythmic thump hiss of the pneumatic tubes, delivering manifests from the lower hives. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. It was the heartbeat of the planet, a mechanical assurance that the system was working, that the tithe was being met, and that we were safe. Time in the spire usually blurred into a gray haze, measured only by the pile of scrollwork accumulating on my desk. I picked up a canister of caffeine sludge, the liquid lukewarm and bitter, and took a sip while verifying the export coding for a shipment of refined ore. My hand hovered over the authorize rune. Everything was routine. Everything was in its place. And then the rhythm broke. The pneumatic tube system didn't just slow down, it ceased. The last canister arrived with a wet thud, and then silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. I waited for the next hiss of air, but the pipes remained dead. The background hum of the heavy cargo lifters down in the bay seemed to drop in pitch, winding down like a dying engine. I sat up straighter, my spine stiffening against the hard metal of the chair. In the administratum, silence is never peace. Silence is an error, and errors are punished. I checked the main diagnostic panel expecting a mechanical jam or a power fluctuation in the lower sectors. The screen flickered, casting a sickly green light over my pale hands. The data stream had frozen. A single blinking prompt appeared in the center of the monitor, pulsing with a slow, malignant regularity. Transaction halted. Authority Governor Valerius. My stomach turned over, a cold knot of dread tightening instantly. It wasn't a jam. The blockade was administrative. The governor hadn't just paused a shipment. He had severed the connection to the Imperial tithe fleet. I looked out the reinforced viewport toward the landing pads. Usually they were ablaze with floodlights and the burning thrusters of landers. Now the lights were dimming section by section, plunging the vast concrete expanse into darkness. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. I looked back at the screen at the 20,000 labor units waiting in the loading bays below. They weren't going anywhere. The numbers weren't balancing. For a scribe of my grade, an unbalanced equation creates a physical itch, a panic that claws at the back of the mind. I realized then that the silence wasn't just a pause in work. It was the sound of a fuse being lit. I stared at the blinking cursor, my finger trembling slightly over the stylus. The governor had refused the collection. I knew the protocols. I knew the ancient laws written in High Gothic that dictated the price of such arrogance. I whispered the total again, but the comfort was gone. 20,000 units. They were no longer assets, they were evidence, and I was the one holding the pen. The silence stayed. Chapter 2. The Declaration. The heat in the Grand Plaza was a physical weight, pressing down on us like a layer of heavy wool. I was not used to the open air. My skin, pale from years under the harsh lumens of the scribe's quarter, felt raw and exposed. Around me, the city of Hive Prime had emptied its guts. Thousands upon thousands of citizens, factory dregs, lower-tier clerks, grease-stained mechanics were packed shoulder to shoulder. The smell was overwhelming. Sweat, cheap recyc alcohol, and the copper tang of excitement. They were shouting, waving improvised banners, their faces twisted in a rapture I could not understand. High above on the gilded balcony of the spire, Governor Valerius stood like a golden idol. His voice boomed from the stadium-sized voxcasters mounted on the plaza walls, rattling my teeth. He spoke of a new dawn. He spoke of resources staying on world. He spoke the word that is a death sentence in every sector of the galaxy independence. I did not cheer. My hands remained at my sides, gripping the hem of my gray robes until my knuckles turned white. While the mob roared at the promise of full bellies and warm winters, my mind was drifting away from the rhetoric and settling into the cold comfort of arithmetic. I looked up at the sky, a bruised purple bruise behind the smog layer. I wasn't listening to the governor's promises. I was calculating logistics. The nearest Imperial subsector naval base was 3 weeks away via standard warp currents. A priority astropathic distress call takes 2 days to verify. Mobilization, perhaps another 4. I did the math in my head, overlaying a countdown clock against the screaming face of the governor. We didn't have a future. We had approximately 27 days before the ledger was balanced. No more starvation, Valerius bellowed, raising a fist, clad in silk and jewels. No more ships taking our grain while our children wither. Today we break the chains of the tithe. The crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of desperate hope. I was jostled, nearly knocked off my feet by a weeping woman who clutched a holy icon to her chest, screaming thanks to a god who I knew was not listening. I felt a profound sense of vertigo, not from the crowd, but from the sheer scale of the error being committed. It was like watching a man walk off a cliff while convinced he could fly. I wanted to shake them. I wanted to scream that the Imperium does not bargain, and it does not forgive. It simply processes. We were not free. We were merely delinquent accounts. Then the sound changed. It was subtle at first, a high-pitched whine underneath the governor's amplified voice. Then it spiked. A tear-shattering screech of static erupted from the massive voxcasters, drowning out the cheers. The governor faltered, tapping his microphone. The crowd fell silent, confused, looking around for the source of the interference. For a single heartbeat, the static cleared, and a voice cut through the air. It wasn't the warm, charismatic baritone of Valerius. It was dry, metallic, and devoid of any human cadence. It sounded like grinding stones. Violation recorded. Assessment initiated. The static snapped back, then faded as quickly as it had arrived. The governor recovered instantly, laughing it off as a malfunction of the old equipment, raising his arms to restart the chanting. The crowd, desperate to believe, followed him back into the frenzy. But I stood frozen. The chill that had started in my spine in the office was now spreading to my limbs. That voice had not come from the planetary network. It had the heavy distortion of a void transmission punched through the atmosphere from high orbit. It was a receipt. The audit had already begun. I lowered my head and tried to disappear into the mass of bodies. I was the only one not looking at the stage. I was looking at the ground, wondering how deep the graves would need to be. It wasn't a malfunction. Chapter 3. The Silence of Stars. The astropathic spire was the highest point of the hive, a needle of black plasteel piercing the smog clouds. I had been summoned there not to pray, but to record. The High Choir was attempting a diplomatic communion, a desperate bid to explain our restructuring to the sector lords before the fleets arrived. The air in the chamber was freezing, kept at sub-zero temperatures to preserve the cogitator banks and the fragile flesh of the piskers. It smelled of old incense and copper, the smell of a church that was also a slaughterhouse. I stood in the corner, my stylus hovering over a fresh data slate, watching the 12 astropaths bound into their gravity couches. They were wretched things, blind and emaciated, their heads shaved and wired with neural jacks. They were the only telephone line we had to the rest of the galaxy. The choir master, a withered husk of a man whose eyes had been sewn shut decades ago, gave the signal. The room began to vibrate. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It was a pressure inside the skull, a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache. They were reaching out. They were trying to cast their minds into the warp, to find the guiding light of the Astronomicon, the beacon of the Emperor, that united all humanity. I watched the monitors. Biosigns spiked. The astropaths began to twitch their mouths, opening in silent screams. Frost formed on their breathers. I noted the time, 0800 hours. Attempt initiated. I waited for the confirmation rune, the green light that meant a message had been sent and received. But the light never came. Instead, the twitching turned into violent convulsions. One of the younger astropaths began to bleed from the nose, the dark liquid freezing instantly on his cheek. The choir master shrieked a sound that wasn't a word, but a realization of absolute terror. The connection wasn't just poor, it was non-existent. The psychic backlash hit the room like a physical blow, knocking the data slate from my hand. The monitors flatlined for a second, before rebooting. The choir slumped in their restraints, unconscious, or dead, I couldn't tell. The silence that followed was heavier than the one in the warehouse. It was the silence of a tomb sealed from the inside. I retrieved my slate with shaking hands. The choir master whispered something, his voice a dry rattle. I leaned in close, needing the official statement for the log. Gone, he wheezed. The light. It is not obscured. It has been turned off. I pulled back, the horror of his words sinking in slowly. The Imperium hadn't sent a fleet to destroy us yet. They had done something far worse. They had revoked our existence. By denying us the Astronomicon, they had shadow-banned an entire planet from the reality of the Empire. To the rest of the galaxy, we were no longer a rebellious world. We were simply empty space. I walked back to the lift, my footsteps echoing loudly on the metal grating. As the doors closed, the ventilation systems kicked back in. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. The mechanical lungs of the spire were still breathing, pumping air for dead men. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal of the lift walls. I looked the same. The city below looked the same. But we were ghosts. The universe had already forgotten us. We were alone in the dark. Chapter 4. The False Paradise. The warehouses were breached on a Tuesday. These were the Tithes silos, massive ferrocrete bunkers that usually required a gene scan from a high prefect to open. But the governor had ordered the mag locks melted down with plasma torches. When the doors groaned open, mountains of grain and crates of vacuum-sealed protein spilled out onto the dirty streets of the lower sectors. It was obscene. This was food, meant for the Imperial Guard armies fighting in the Segmentum Solar. It was holy fuel for the war machine. And now, I watched from the walkway as the mob tore into it with dirty hands. They weren't just eating, they were gorging. Children were playing in mounds of processed wheat like it was snow. The air, usually smelling of ozone and despair, was thick with the scent of yeast and curing salt. It made me dizzy. It made me salivate against my will. Along with the food came the rumors. They spread faster than a viral outbreak in the Hab blocks. They said a rogue trader was coming. The Gilded Saint, a legendary free merchant who operated on the fringes of Imperial law, a man who didn't care about the High Lords of Terra, only about profit. The story went that Valerius had cut a deal we would trade our minerals directly to him, bypassing the administratum entirely. We would be partners, not slaves. I sat at my terminal listening to the chatter on the Vox channels. Logic told me it was a fantasy. Rogue traders are sharks, not saviors. But looking at the full bellies of the workers below, the logic began to blur. I opened a new file on my cogitator. I didn't label it Tithe Assessment. I labeled it Commercial Export Projection. For the first time in my life, I wasn't calculating a debt. I was calculating a profit. That night, I committed a crime with a fork and a knife. I had secured a ration pack of cured grox meat, a delicacy usually reserved for the off-world transport crews. I sat alone in my Hab unit, the slab of meat dark and oily on my plastic plate. It smelled of smoke and spices I couldn't name. I cut a slice. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a strange, illicit thrill. I put the meat in my mouth. The flavor was explosive salt-fat richness. It was the taste of freedom. I closed my eyes, letting the texture dissolve on my tongue, pushing away the image of the silent astropaths and the dark sky. I thought maybe Valerius is right. Maybe we were starving for nothing. I swallowed. The meat went down heavy, sitting in my stomach like a dense, warm stone. I looked at my fingers, glistening with grease. I felt satisfied, full, and strangely powerful. But as I wiped my hand on a rag, the grease left a dark smear, hard to clean off. I stared at it. It didn't look like dinner. It looked like I had dipped my hand in something that would never wash away. We were eating the Emperor's property. I told myself it tasted like victory. But deep down in the pit of my full stomach, I knew what it really was. It was the last meal of the condemned. Chapter 5, Dirty Hands. The purge did not look like a war. It looked like bureaucracy. To prepare for the arrival of the rogue trader, the Governor's Council decided that our society needed to be sanitized. They called it removing the old variables. They meant people. I was summoned to a temporary processing center set up in the basement of the Department of Labor. The air here was damp and smelled of bleach, a chemical scent so strong it burned the lining of my nose. My job was simple. I had to cross-reference the employment history of the administrative staff, looking for those with deep ties to the off-world administratum. They wanted to root out spies. They wanted to find anyone who might open the back door when the Imperium came knocking. I sat at a metal table, a stack of data slates in front of me, working under the flickering light of a single lumen strip. I worked efficiently, highlighting names in red. These were men and women. I had shared lunch with people whose children I knew by name. Now they were just errors in the new system. I felt nothing. I told myself I was just cleaning the ledger. Then I swiped to the next file, and my heart stopped. The face on the screen was mine. Subject: Kalen. Designation: Grade 4 Scribe. Risk assessment: Moderate. Reason: strict adherence to Imperial protocol. The text was glowing in amber, waiting for a confirmation to turn red. My hands went cold. The room seemed to tilt. I looked up and saw the enforcers at the door, their shock mauls resting casually on their hips. They weren't looking at me yet, but they would be. I had minutes, perhaps seconds, before someone reviewed this batch. Panic is a clumsy thing, but self-preservation is a razor. My fingers moved across the stylus pad with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I needed a scapegoat. I needed a variable to replace my own. I scrolled down the list and found him. Senior Scribe Harkin. The man who had taught me how to hold a quill, who had shown me how to soothe the machine spirit of a temperamental cogitator. He was old, he was slow, he was expendable. I accessed his file. With 3 swift taps, I transferred the risk assessment flag from my file to his. I added a fabricated note about a hidden Vox transmitter found in his quarters. I watched the amber light on his file turn a deep, condemning red. On my file, the light turned green. 2 hours later, I watched them drag Harkin out of the line. He didn't scream. He just looked confused, squinting in the harsh light, his glasses hanging askew on his face. He looked at me as he passed his eyes, searching for an explanation for help. I looked down at my data slate. I focused on the alignment of the columns. I forced myself to swallow the bile rising in my throat. I told myself this was necessary. If the planet was to be free, we needed people who could adapt, not old relics like him. I was part of the future. He was just part of the cost. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't say sorry. I just marked the task as complete and requested the next batch. The bleach smell was stronger now, or perhaps it was just the taste of my own betrayal. It wasn't murder. It was just editing. Chapter 6. Industrial Winter. It has been 6 months since the heaters died. The great thermal exchangers that pumped warmth from the planet's core have gone silent, starved of the plasma fuel that the governor swore was being stockpiled. It turns out, you cannot burn speeches for warmth. The hive city, once a sweating, groaning beast of industry, has become a tomb of ice and iron. Frost patterns crawl across the interior bulkheads, beautiful and deadly. In the scribe quarters, we huddle together under piles of rags, our breath misting in the air like escaping souls. The golden saint, the rogue traitor who was supposed to save us, never arrived. The sky remains empty, save for the indifferent stars. Every day I check the manifest for incoming ships. Every day the column reads 0. The hope that sustained us in the beginning has turned into something brittle and sharp, like the icicles hanging from the gantries. Hunger does strange things to a man. It doesn't just empty your stomach, it hollows out your morality. I was walking through the suspended walkways of Sector 7, clutching my weekly ration bar, a gray, brick-hard slab of recycled nutrients. It was supposed to last me 3 days. I heard the footsteps behind me before I saw him. He was a shift supervisor, a man who used to command respect, now reduced to a shivering skeleton wrapped in plastic sheeting. He didn't ask for the food. He simply lunged his eyes wide with the madness of starvation. He clawed at my chest, his fingernails digging into my robes, snapping at the ration bar like a feral dog. I stumbled back, slamming into the railing. Below us, the dark abyss of the underhive waited. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. My hand moved to my belt, not for a weapon, but for my tools. I drew my data stylus. I had spent weeks sharpening the tip against the concrete floor, not to write better, but because I knew this day would come. I drove the metal spike into his shoulder. It didn't feel like striking a man. It felt like punching a wet sandbag. He gasped a wet bubbling sound and released me. He fell back, clutching the wound, looking at me with shock. Not that I had hurt him, but that a scribe, a man of soft hands and paper, had drawn blood. The smell hit me instantly, copper and salt, hot and nauseating in the freezing air. It steamed in the cold. I stood over him, my chest heaving. I didn't offer to help him. I didn't call a medic. I gripped the stylus tighter, the smooth metal slick with his blood. It was no longer an instrument of administration. It was a shiv. I looked at the red liquid staining my fingers, contrasting against the gray of my uniform. I realized then, that the governor's promise of a new trade route was a lie to keep us docile while the larder emptied. There was no rogue trader. There was no plan. We were just cattle in a pen that had run out of feed. I looked at the man bleeding on the grating, then turned and walked away. I ate the ration bar as I walked, the taste of processed starch mixing with the metallic tang of blood on my hands. The cold didn't bother me as much after that. I was already freezing from the inside out. Chapter 7. Signal from the Abyss. The silence of our isolation was not broken by an explosion. It was broken by a chime. I was in the communications bunker, a hardened concrete shell buried beneath the government spire. We spent our nights scanning the background radiation of the void, looking for the thermal signature of the imaginary rogue trader. The screens were usually a wash of static, the visual representation of our abandonment. But then the primary console lit up. A single crisp signal cut through the interference like a scalpel through rotten meat. It wasn't a fleet. It was a single vessel, small and fast. A Proclamator-class herald ship. It hung in the upper atmosphere, a black speck against the bruising purple of the nebula, motionless and terrible. It didn't hail the governor. It didn't ask for landing coordinates. It simply opened a channel on every frequency from the military encrypted networks to the civilian voxcasters in the hab blocks. I put on my headset, my hands trembling as I adjusted the gain. The voice that filled my ears was the same one I had heard briefly in the plaza months ago, but now it was clear. It was terrifyingly distinct. "Attention planetary asset Delta 9, the voice rasped. It sounded like dry leaves sliding over concrete. This was Magister Volt. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound like a conqueror. He sounded like a disappointed accountant. "You are in default. Tithe grade absolutus. Overdue 189 standard days. Accrued interest penalty applied." I watched the audio waveform on the screen. It was perfectly flat, devoid of any human modulation. The other operators in the bunker were freezing up, pulling off their headsets, blood draining from their faces. But I pressed the cups tighter to my ears. I needed to hear the verdict. Volt continued. "The Adeptus. Terra does not recognize the concept of independence. We recognize only compliance or liquidation. Your debt exceeds the projected value of your future labor output. Therefore, the asset is to be liquidated to recover base materials. Penalty total cleansing." The words hung in the air heavy and absolute. He wasn't talking about war. He was talking about scrapping a car. "The Imperium does not punish," Volt added, and I could almost hear the servos in his jaw clicking. "The Imperium only balances the books." The transmission ended, but the channel didn't close. It began to loop. The message repeated over and over, a mechanical chant of doom. The comforting thump hiss of the bunker's ventilation, the sound I had associated with safety since childhood, was drowned out by the screeching electronic repetition. Default, liquidation, cleansing. I looked around the room. Men were crying. One woman was simply staring at the ceiling catatonic. I slowly took off the headset and placed it on the desk. The silence of the stars was gone, replaced by the noise of our own extinction. We weren't rebels anymore. We were just bad debt. Chapter 8. The Final Arrogance. The Strategic Command Center was a theater of delusions. Hollow tables projected a glowing blue sphere of our world, surrounded by the empty darkness of space. Governor Valerius paced the raised platform, his face flushed with the manic energy of a man gambling with chips he doesn't own. He pointed a trembling finger at the single red dot on the radar, the Proclamator herald ship. "They mock us," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "They send one ship to demand our surrender, one ship to enslave us." The generals nodded sycophants to the end, too afraid to tell him the truth. I stood in the shadows of the databanks watching the telemetry. My stomach was a knot of cold iron. I knew what a proclamator was. You do not shoot the messenger of the administratum. To kill a herald is not an act of war, it is an act of heresy. It removes the possibility of penal servitude and replaces it with annihilation. Fire the orbital batteries, Valerius commanded. The order hung in the air, a physical thing heavy with doom. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to shout that the ship was just a buoy, a marker, and that the real fleet was waiting just beyond the sensor shadow listening. But my throat was dry, sealed shut by years of obedience. I watched the weapons officers key in the sequence. Their hands didn't shake. They believed the lie. On the main screen, streaks of golden fire rose from the surface, converging on that single stationary black speck in the upper atmosphere. The impact was silent in the vacuum, a blooming flower of orange fire that briefly outshone the sun. The red dot vanished. The room erupted in cheers. Men hugged each other. The governor threw his head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. The laughter lasted exactly 12 seconds. Then the proximity alarms began to scream. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a warning. It was a continuous, deafening wail. The main view screen flickered the image of the burning debris, replaced by a sudden wash of static. Then the sensors cleared, and the blue space around our planet turned red. They didn't fly in. They tore reality apart to get here. Hundreds of warp rifts opened simultaneously, bleeding purple energy into the void. Massive Gothic prows emerged from the tier ships the size of cities, their hulls covered in cathedral spires and gun decks. The Tithe fleet. They hadn't been days away. They had been sitting in the warp, waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for the justification. The cheers died instantly. The governor froze his mouth half open, his laugh dying in his throat. The radar screen was no longer showing empty space. It was a solid wall of hostile contacts. I looked at the scrolling data. Cruisers, frigates, bulk lifters for mass transport, and at the center, a battleship of the Retribution class. The sheer mass of the fleet triggered gravity warnings on the planetary crust sensors. I looked down at my console, at the pen I was still holding. I opened my fingers and let it drop. It clattered onto the metal floor, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence of the room. There was no point in counting anymore. We had just signed our own death warrants. Chapter 9. The Bookkeeper's Choice. Before the first lance strikes the earth, I have a request. The data must flow. If you are witnessing this record, leave a like and subscribe. It is a small gesture, meaningless in the face of orbital bombardment, but in the administratum, even the smallest mark on a ledger proves you were here. Do it now, before the signal fails. The first impact did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the world snapping in half. The orbital lance struck the shield generator of the governor's palace, a precise surgical incision of pure energy that vaporized 3 city blocks in a microsecond. The shockwave hit our administrative complex moments later. The floor heaved upward, throwing me against the metal banks of the cogitators. Dust, ancient and choking, rained down from the ventilation ducts, turning the air into a gray fog. Sirens began to wail, a rising and falling scream that signaled the final evacuation. Condition black, the automated voice droned. Shelter immediately. This is not a drill. I scrambled to my feet, coughing, my eyes stinging. Around me, the other scribes were abandoning their posts. They were running towards the heavy blast doors of the deep crust bunkers, clutching photos of their families, weeping in terror. I joined the stampede, the animal instinct to survive taking over my legs. I had 2 minutes. 2 minutes before the void shields collapsed completely, and the rain of fire began in earnest. I reached the doorway, my hand on the release mechanism, ready to descend into the safety of the dark. Then I looked back. Through the haze of dust and sparking wires, I saw it. The central server bank. The black monolith that housed the census tithe, data, the genetic codes, the employment histories, the production quotas of every living soul on the planet. The glowing blue light on the drive indicated it was still active, still vulnerable. A thought cold and alien pierced through my panic. If I go down into that bunker, I am just another mouth to feed. Just another rebel to be purged. The Imperium does not rescue survivors. It reclaims assets. And without that data, we were just waste biomass. But with it, with the ledger, I had value. I let go of the door handle. The heavy blast doors began to slide shut, sealing the others inside. I turned my back on safety. I ran back into the trembling room towards the server. The ceiling groaned, a structural beam buckling under the stress. I didn't care. I reached the console and jammed my personal data spike into the port. Backup initiated the screen read. It would take 90 seconds. The building was shaking violently now, chunks of ferrocrete falling around me like hail. I didn't run. I stood there shielding the drive with my body, watching the progress bar crawl forward. I was no longer a man afraid of death. I was a mechanism ensuring the continuity of the record. The upload completed with a soft chime. I pulled the drive free and clutched it to my chest, curling into a ball under the desk as the roof finally gave way. I chose the data. I chose to be useful. Chapter 10. Black Angels. I did not hear them land. The bombardment had left my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that masked the approach of the drop pods. I dragged myself out of the rubble of the server room, my uniform torn and gray with dust. The corridor outside was a ruin of twisted metal and sparking cables. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and pulverized stone. Through the haze, I saw them. They were not men. They were towering monoliths of black ceramite moving with a terrifying fluid grace that defied their bulk. The Emperor's angels. We had been taught to pray to them, to view them as saviors who would descend on wings of fire to deliver us. But standing there, pressing my back against the cold, vibrating wall, I saw no salvation. I saw only efficient, industrialized slaughter. They moved in silence, their bolters coughing short, explosive barks that turned the panicked palace guards into red mist. I froze. To run was to attract attention. To attract attention was to die. I clutched the hard drive to my chest like a shield, the sharp edges of the casing digging into my skin. One of the giants turned towards me. His helmet was a skull-like mask of black iron with glowing red lenses that pierced the gloom. He stepped over the broken body of a receptionist without breaking stride. The floor shook under his weight. I stared into those red eyes, waiting for the muzzle flash, waiting for the end. In that moment, the vox casters on the walls, miraculously still functioning, crackled to life. It was Magister Volt again. His voice was calm, weaving through the sounds of carnage like a conductor's baton. Directives update. Priority Alpha. Secure data repositories and sorting camps. Priority Beta Tithe grade biomass. Civilian population expendable. Lethal force authorized for all non-compliant units. The giant stopped. He was less than a meter away from me. I could smell the promethium exhaust from his power pack and the ancient holy oil on his armor. The barrel of his bolter was leveled at my chest. It was wide enough to fit my fist inside. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the brass ID tag pinned to my collar, Scribe Grade 4. Then his gaze dropped to the data drive in my hands, blinking with the blue light of a completed backup. The red lenses whirred as they focused. A harsh mechanical growl emerged from the helmet's grill. Asset identified. Archivist. Hold position. He lowered the weapon. He didn't offer me a hand. He didn't tell me I was safe. He simply turned his massive back to me and continued down the hall, firing a burst into a fleeing group of clerks. I slid down the wall until I hit the floor, my legs turning to water. I realized then the nature of my miracle. He hadn't spared me because I was a human being with a soul. He had spared me because I was holding the receipt. I wasn't a person to the Imperium anymore. I was a peripheral device, a component required to read the data I carried. I sat in the dust, clutching the drive, listening to the screams fade away as the Black Angels moved deeper into the complex. I was alive, but I felt colder than the dead men around me. Chapter 11. The Reverse Run. The city streets had become a river of flesh. A screaming, panicked torrent of humanity poured out of the hab blocks, flowing instinctively towards the lower hives and the western wastes. They carried what little they could, children wrapped in blankets, bags of stale crusts, idols of the Emperor that they hoped would still protect them. The air was thick with the gray snow of ash and the acrid sting of burning plastic. I stood in the doorway of the ruined administrative complex watching them run. Every instinct in my reptilian brain screamed at me to join them, to vanish into the labyrinth of the Underhive, to find a dark hole and wait for the storm to pass. But I didn't move. I watched the flow of the crowd, and I remembered the tactical manuals I had transcribed years ago for the Planetary Defense Force. I knew this pattern. The Imperium does not chase rats into the sewers. It seals the pipes and flushes them out. The strategy is called the hammer and anvil. The drop pods and shock troops at the spaceport were the hammer, driving the population towards the safety of the open wastelands. And waiting in the wastelands, positioned days ago by low-orbit drops, would be the anvil-heavy bolter emplacements and flame tanks. The people running west weren't escaping. They were herding themselves into a kill zone. To run with them was to die in a firestorm. To live, I had to do the one thing that felt entirely insane. I had to run towards the invasion. I stepped out into the street and turned against the current. It was a physical struggle. I was shoved, cursed at, and spat upon. A woman grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror, screaming that I was walking into the jaws of the beast. I shook her off. I couldn't explain to her that the beast's jaws were the safest place to be provided you were a tooth and not the meat. I pushed through the wall of bodies, clutching the data drive like a holy relic. I kept my eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the spaceport, the epicenter of the Imperial landing. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that tried to override my cold logic, but I forced my legs to move, step by step, against the flood. I reached the first Imperial checkpoint at the intersection of the commercial district. Barricades had been erected from the rubble of a statue of Governor Valerius. Behind them stood the Tempestus Scion's elite stormtroopers, in carapace armor, their hellguns humming with lethal charge. They saw me emerging from the smoke, a lone figure walking away from safety. 10 laser sights painted my chest with ruby dots. I didn't raise my empty hands. I raised the drive. I shouted the only code that mattered. Admin level clearance. I have the population manifest. I have the tithe data. The red dots didn't waver. For a second, I thought I had miscalculated. Then a sergeant signaled with a sharp chop of his hand. 2 troopers vaulted the barricade, seized me by the arms, and dragged me behind the line. They didn't treat me gently. They threw me into a mobile containment cage, a cold metal box already smelling of fear. But they didn't shoot me. I gripped the bars, looking back at the street where the mob was still fleeing towards their doom. In the distance, the heavy thud of artillery began to sound from the west. The anvil had begun its work. I sat down on the metal floor. I was a prisoner, but I was breathing. I had run into the fire to avoid the slaughter. Chapter 12. The Grand Forger. The processing camp was not a prison. It was a factory floor where the raw material was human. I was dragged into a requisitioned warehouse, the roof torn open to the gray sky cables snaking across the wet floor like black vipers. In the center of the chaos sat a single functioning cogitator terminal, powered by a sputtering portable generator. It was an oasis of order in a desert of screaming madness. But the seat was taken. Another scribe was hunched over the keyboard. He was young, perhaps barely out of the sholom, his hands shaking so violently that he kept missing the keys. He was weeping softly, a constant irritating whimper that mixed with the hum of the machine. He was trying to access the central database, trying to prove his worth just as I was, but his fear had made him clumsy. He was locking the system with failed password attempts. The scion guarding the terminal watched him with the disinterest of a man watching a fly buzz against a window. He checked the charge on his hellgun, then looked at me, then back at the weeping boy. "Efficiency is mandatory," the scion said, his voice distorted by the Vox grill of his helmet. "We have one uplink. We need one operator. The other is biomass." The equation was presented to me with brutal simplicity. There was no trial, no evaluation of our respective service records. There was only the machine, the seat, and the two of us. The boy looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. He recognized my rank insignia. He saw a senior, a mentor. "Help me," he whispered, shifting to make room on the bench. I can't remember the right of access. Please." I looked at the screen. The prompt was flashing red. He had tripped the security lockout. If I helped him, we would both be delayed. Delay meant death. If I pushed him aside, it would be a struggle. I didn't have the strength to fight him, but I had a weapon far sharper than a knife. I looked at the scion, keeping my face perfectly smooth, masking the sudden acceleration of my heart. I pointed a steady finger at the boy. "He is not forgetting the code." I said, my voice loud and clear over the generator's roar. "He is a saboteur. I saw him entering the deletion syntax. He's trying to wipe the tithe records." The lie hung in the air for less than a second. The scion didn't ask for proof. The Imperium does not take chances with its data. The hell gun rose. There was a single sharp crack of ionized air. The boy didn't even have time to scream. He was thrown backward off the chair, a smoking hole in his chest, his eyes still wide with the betrayal he hadn't fully comprehended. He hit the wet concrete with a wet slap. And then he was just an object, an obstruction to be stepped over. The scion gestured to the empty seat with the barrel of his smoking gun. "Work," he commanded. I stepped over the body of my colleague. I didn't look down. I sat in the chair. The plastic was still warm from his body heat. It was a grotesque intimacy, sitting in the warmth of the man I had just murdered with a sentence. I placed my hands on the keys. My fingers didn't shake. I entered my clearance code. The screen turned from angry red to compliant green. I began to organize the files, the rhythm of my typing, drowning out the sound of the body being dragged away behind me. I had bought this seat with a lie. I had paid for my life with his. And as the data stream began to flow, I realized the transaction was acceptable. The chair was comfortable. Chapter 13, Idle Falling. We returned to the Grand Plaza, but the banners were gone. The gilded balconies where Valerius had stood like a sun god were now draped in the harsh utilitarian black of the administratum. The crowd was there too, herded into neat silent rows by the prods of shock malls. They were not cheering today. They were shivering, their heads bowed, terrified that making eye contact with the conquerors would invite selection. I sat at a portable scrivener's desk at the foot of the dais, my fingers hovering over the keypad. I was the official witness. I was the one who would write the final entry in the history of our rebellion. They dragged him out. Governor Valerius, the man who had promised us the stars, was not walking tall. He was being pulled across the flagstones by two servitors, mindless cyborg drones that were once men. Valerius was stripped of his silks. He wore a ragged gray jumpsuit stained with his own filth, He wasn't shouting defiance. He wasn't making a final heroic speech about freedom. He was weeping. It was a wet, ugly sound that echoed off the cold stone walls. He looked small. Without the stage lights and the Vox amplifiers, he was just a soft, terrified man who had overdrawn his account. He collapsed at the feet of Magister Vult, grasping at the Magister's red robes, begging for mercy in a high, thin voice that made my skin crawl. Magister Vult did not look down. He stood like a statue of judgment, his face hidden behind a rebreather mask that hissed with every breath. He held a scroll in his metal hand. He didn't speak to Valerius. He spoke to the heir to the record. Subject Valerius. Crime gross. Mismanagement of Imperial assets. Theft of time. Waste of biomass. Volt paused the silence, stretching tight enough to snap. Valerius sobbed, I can be useful. I know the codes. I can govern. Volt finally looked down, his red ocular lenses whirring. Correct. You can be useful. The Imperium wastes nothing. The sentence was not death. Death would have been a release. Death would have made him a martyr. Volt raised his hand. Sentence class Omega lobotomy. Reassignment sanitation servitor sub-level 4. The crowd gasped a collective intake of breath that was instantly silenced by the racking of bolters. Valerius screamed a raw, primal shriek of absolute horror as the tech priests stepped forward with their surgical drills buzzing. They didn't even take him away. They began the procedure right there on the stones to show us that our leader was nothing more than biological hardware waiting to be reformatted. I looked at my screen. The cursor blinked in the field labeled Former Designation. I typed the word Governor. My finger hovered over the Enter key. For half a second, a ghost of the old loyalty flared up, a memory of the hope I had felt when he spoke of freedom. My hand froze, but then I heard the wet, tearing sound of the drill meeting bone, and the screaming stopped, replaced by a dull, confused gurgling. The hesitation vanished. I hit the backspace key. Deleted. I typed in the new reality. Designation error unit. I saved the file. Saved. He was never a god. He was just a broken calculator. Chapter 14. The Harvest. The warehouses where we once stored grain were now filled with a different kind of commodity. Since the planet had eaten its own tithe during the blockade, the debt had to be paid in an alternative currency. The Imperium calls it manpower tithe. We called it the harvest. I stood at a high lectern overlooking the sorting floor, a vast ocean of gray heads bobbing in the dim light. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies' urine, and a terror so potent it tasted like copper on the tongue. Thousands of my people, neighbors, shopkeepers, teachers, shuffled forward in silence towards the 3 great iron gates at the far end of the hall. They looked up at me, the man with the stylus, thinking I was their judge. I wasn't. I was just the cashier scanning the barcodes on the meat. There were 3 categories for the harvest. Gate 1 was indentured labor, a life of slavery in the void ships or the mines of a penal moon. That was the mercy. Gate 2 was servitor conversion, where the body is kept, but the mind is scrubbed and replaced with cogitators. That was a horror. But Gate 3 was the one that made my hand tremble, if only for the first hour. Gate 3 was biological reclamation. When a unit is too old, too sick, or too young to work, they are not discarded. The Imperium wastes nothing. They are sent to the vat processors to be rendered down into corpse starch, the nutrient paste that feeds the armies of the Emperor. I looked at the manifest. The column for biomass was still under quota. I needed more weight. A family stepped up to my station. I recognized them. It was the baker from Sector 4 and his wife. I remembered the smell of fresh bread from their shop, a memory from a life that felt like it belonged to a dead man. The baker was emaciated, his skin hanging off his bones, like wet paper. He looked at me, his eyes lighting up with a flicker of recognition, perhaps even hope. "Kalen," he whispered, clutching his wife's hand. "Is that you? Help us. Please. The little one." He gestured to the bundle in his wife's arms. A baby no more than 6 months old, silent and staring with large, glassy eyes. I looked at the data slate. I looked at their vitals, scanned by the servo skull hovering over my desk. Subject A, malnutrition severe. Musculoskeletal atrophy. Subject B, postpartum weakness. Subject C, below labor age threshold. They were useless to the mines. They would die in transit. They were wasted cargo space. But as biomass, as raw protein, they solved an equation. The baker smiled, a desperate, trembling thing. He thought our shared history mattered. He thought the bread he had sold me mattered. I didn't speak. I didn't look him in the eye. I tapped the icon for Gate 3. A red light flashed above their heads. The floor panels beneath them hissed and opened. They didn't even have time to scream before they dropped into the collection chutes below. The baby let out a single sharp cry that was instantly cut off by the slamming of the metal hatch. The sound echoed in the vast hall for a fraction of a second, a tiny note of tragedy in a symphony of industrial noise. I watched the biomass counter on my screen tick upward by 120 kilograms. I felt a phantom sensation of nausea, but I crushed it instantly under the weight of my training. I wasn't murdering my neighbors. I was balancing the ledger. "Next unit," I called out. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who had forgotten how to smell the bread. Chapter 15. The Volt Assessment. The field office of Magister Vult was not a place of command. It was a place of autopsy. It was a prefabricated module set up in the ruins of the governor's rose garden, the walls lined with glowing screens displaying the casualty rates of the harvest in real time. The air was scrubbed so clean it tasted metallic, devoid of the smoke and rot that choked the rest of the city. I stood before his desk, my hands clasped behind my back, staring at the floor. I was waiting for the bolt pistol. I knew how the Imperium worked. Collaborators are useful during the transition, but once the work is done, they are loose ends. Loose ends are untidy, and Magister Vult hated untidiness. Vult sat behind the desk, his red robes pooling around him like spilled blood. He didn't look up from his work. He simply reached into the folds of his garment and pulled out a small, battered object. He tossed it onto the metal surface of the desk. It slid across and stopped inches from my hand. I looked down. It was the data drive I had stolen from the burning server room. But next to it, he placed something else, a transcript of the security log from the processing camp. The log where I had accused the young scribe of being a spy. The log where I had ordered his death to steal his chair. "I have reviewed your file, Scribe Kalen Vult," said his voice, a grinder of gravel and static. "You have a fascinating error rate. You flagged Senior Scribe Harkin as a traitor. You flagged Scribe Cadet Tybalt as a saboteur. You flagged Governor Valerius as a non-entity." He finally looked up, his ocular lenses rotating as they zoomed in on my sweating face. "Statistically, it is impossible for one man to uncover 3 high-level treasonous acts in one fiscal quarter. The probability approaches 0. I couldn't breathe. My throat closed up. He knew. He knew I was a liar. He knew I was a murderer who had climbed over the corpses of my colleagues to stay alive. I waited for the order to the guards. I waited for the servitors to drag me to the drills. I started to stammer, a desperate defense forming on my lips, but he cut me off with a raised metal hand. "Silence, Vult," commanded. "You misunderstand the nature of this audit. The Imperium is vast, Scribe. It is a machine fed by blood and oiled by cruelty. We have billions of honest men. Honest men hesitate. Honest men feel pity. Honest men slow down the quota. He picked up the drive and crushed it in his bionic grip, the plastic shattering with a dry snap. You did not hesitate. You saw the variable human life, and you subtracted it to balance the equation. You are a liar and a killer, Kalen. And that is exactly why I am requisitioning you. He slid a contract across the desk. It was stamped with the seal of the Tithe fleet. We are leaving this rock. There are 1,000 other worlds in default. 1,000 other harvests to manage. I need men who can look at a child and see only biomass. Sign. I stared at the paper. It wasn't a death sentence. It was a career. I picked up the quill. My hand didn't shake. I realized then that the bolt pistol would have been a kindness. I wasn't being punished. I was being promoted. Chapter 16. The Last Ship. The Proclamator vessel was silent in a way the hive never was. There was no grinding of gears, no shouting of the mob, only the subsonic hum of the void shield generators and the rhythmic cycling of the scrubbers. The air smelled of nothing. No sweat, no smoke, no fear. Just cold, sterile ozone. I sat at my new station, a sleek console of brushed steel and glowing lumens. I wore the gray uniform of the fleet Tithe now. The fabric was stiff, scratching at my neck, a constant reminder of the collar I had willingly put on. My hands, once stained with ink and dust, were clean. I had scrubbed them until the skin was raw, but I could still feel the phantom grease of the bakery, the phantom blood of the supervisor. The screen in front of me scrolled with the manifest of the biomass recovery from Delta 9. My home was being liquidated, converted into numbers and caloric values. My job was quality control. I had to verify that the genetic markers of the processed material met the standards for corpse starch production. It was a simple task. Approve, approve, approve. My finger tapped the rune with the regularity of a metronome. Then the scrolling stopped. A single file hovered in the center of the display. Subject Ilara. Relation sibling. Status processing Q4. I stared at the name. A memory tried to surface a laugh. In a sunlit room, the smell of rain on hot pavement. A shared secret whispered in the dark. My sister. She was in Q4. That meant she was still alive, waiting in the cold antechamber of the processor. I knew the codes. I had the clearance now. With 3 keystrokes, I could reclassify her. I could change her status from fuel to hard labor. I could send her to a mining colony. It would be a hard life, a brutal life, but it would be a life. My hand hovered over the keys. The cursor blinked, waiting for the input. It was the same choice I had faced in the bunker, the same choice I had faced with the spy. But this time, it was my own blood. I looked at the reflection in the black glass of the monitor. The face staring back was gaunt, the eyes hollow and dark. It wasn't Kalen the brother. It wasn't Kalen the rebel. It was Kalen the scribe. If I saved her, I created a discrepancy. Discrepancies lead to audits. Audits lead to death. The Magister's words echoed in my mind. Honest men hesitate. I felt a flicker of something in my chest, grief perhaps, or love, but it was distant, like a shout from a room I had locked long ago. I didn't want the complication. I didn't want the fear. I wanted the silence of the numbers. I wanted the ledger to be perfect. I moved my hand. I didn't type the override code. I moved the cursor to the approve box. I pressed down. The screen flashed green. Processed. The file vanished, replaced by the next name in the list. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I reached for the lever that engaged the grinder mechanisms for Q4. I pulled it down with a smooth, practiced motion. The ship shuddered slightly as the machinery engaged a low, hungry vibration that traveled up through the floor and into my bones. If you wish to remain on the right side of the ledger, and if you want to be there when I open the next archive, click the like button and subscribe. Do it now. The Administratum is watching, and they do not look kindly on those who do not register their presence until the next cycle. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the shift. The dark is heavy, and the silence of space can be maddening without another soul to share the burden. I have told you my truth, not to ask for forgiveness, for there is no forgiveness in the 41st millennium, but so that you might understand the cost of survival.